Okay, so I'm going to offer some thoughts on modernism and science studies, and mostly seeking a way around the old two cultures chestnut, which if you haven't run across C.P. Snow's formulation of that, I'll mention it in a minute. I think it's kind of done more harm than good over the years. And was also, there was a bureaucratic agenda behind that in the 1950s, and it kind of got taken as being more significant than it was ultimately. My talk today is primarily going to focus on the Anglophone world, largely because that's where my research has been, largely because I don't really have the language skills to do this very well in the languages that you all speak, but I would be very interested to hear your thoughts about how these issues play out in a Flemish context, for instance. I would be quite appreciative of that. So it's clearly not going to be news to anyone in the room today that we can kind of roughly pigeonhole modernism. I think the 1890 to 1950 window is a pretty good one. The first half of the 20th century in the Anglophone world fits pretty well for that too. But it also cuts across an awful lot of changes in the sciences in exactly the same window, and it's that connection with the literary that I want to focus on a little bit today. So there's obviously the Ezra Pound, Virginia Woolf, Harry Monroe, Gertrude Stein. These are figures, Mary Moore, Wallace Stevens. I should have put a slide of Stevens up there, are quite familiar figures. Martin Hartley, Alfred Stieglitz. This is kind of what just immediately comes to mind with modernism. But also the connection of Anglophone modernism to the continental avant-garde, and I think especially to the period I'm looking at, Italian futurism was a really important interlocutor for a lot of my artists. But Ezra Pound's adage, "Make it new," which was allegedly a repetition of an inscription found on a wash bowl of Chung Tung, the first king of the Shan dynasty, so 1766 to 1753 BC. Obviously, whatever was on that wash bowl meant something very different from what Ezra Pound meant by it. But it became a kind of mantra for modernism, for Pound, that in a way kind of aligns with what someone like Marinetti was saying, but I don't think they really meant the same thing by that. But what I want to do is push this make it new into the direction of the sciences a little bit and see what kind of play it has there. So without a doubt, a crucial feature of this age was the high degree to which many people self-consciously understood themselves to be participating in a present intensely marked by its modernity and modernization. So my early modern colleagues at Penn State like to remind me that, when you talk about modernity, we're talking about 1590. We're not talking about. It's a very specific period in which technological modernization looks very different than it did certainly in 1590. But this self-consciousness of modernity and modernization was shared, I think, by scientists and engineers, inventors, marketers of new technology, so much so that we might speak of a scientific and technological modernism. I don't know whether historians of science would like this or not, but I'm going to stick with it anyway. That's, in fact, still in some ways present in contemporary culture. And so what follows is going to be a broad portrait of the emergence of modernist science and modernist culture collectively. And a little bit of a thought about the methodological strands that have to come together to make that argument. If you've read my Modernism, Science, and Technology book, this is in a way it's kind of a condensed version of the argument in that book, so I hope I won't bore you with that. So I want to start with the two cultures idea, because it's something that the past couple of decades of scholarship on modernist and contemporary literature have really challenged and offered new perspectives on. It's been critiqued for decades. There were people, even when C.P. Snow made this argument, who were not very comfortable with it. But it still persists even in this first part of the 21st century. So while the modernist period of shifting scientific paradigms emerging technological frames, and proliferating modernist and avant-garde manifestations in the literature and the arts certainly witnessed an increasing specialization of scientific knowledge and professionalization, it would be anachronistic to read the motivations of post-World War II arguments about the two cultures back into the 1910s or 20s. Indeed, it has become a familiar critical gesture over the past few decades for scholars working in the history of science or science and literature to warn against a too ready acceptance of the bifurcation asserted by C.P. Snow's famous catchphrase, the two cultures, and his bemoaning the separation of the sciences and literature among intellectuals. And of course, Snow was if you don't know his work, he was also a novelist. He was a literary figure, not a horribly good novelist, but he tried. So in May 1959, after modernism had really begun to wane in the U.S. and Western Europe, Snow delivered his famous Reed lecture on the two cultures. This is at Cambridge, and then expanded it into a book of the same name. In 1995, the Times Literary Supplement that called it one of the 100 most influential books since World War II. Maybe an overstatement, but maybe not. So Snow argued in this that the intellectual life of the whole of Western society is increasingly being split into two polar groups. When I say the intellectual life, I mean to include also a large part of our practical life, because I should be the last person to suggest that the two can at the deepest level be distinguished. So as he saw it, there were, quote, literary intellectuals at one pole, at the other, scientists, and as the most representative, the physical sciences. Between the two, a gulf of mutual incomprehension, sometimes, particularly among the young, hostility and dislike, but most of all, lack of understanding. Interesting, a few years back I gave a talk on a little bit on C.P. Snow in China, and my Chinese audience felt like, yeah, exactly. I mean, they felt like what Snow was saying really described contemporary Chinese academia, which is interesting in itself. But by the later 1980s, an influential series in the rapidly growing field of literature and science could dismiss the two cultures thesis as not very helpful cliche, and as George Levine argued, this is the second quote on the slide, it's possible and fruitful to understand how literature and science are mutually shaped by their participation in the culture at large, in the intellectual, moral, aesthetic, social, economic, and political communities which both generate and take their shape from them. And this just seems to be completely obvious, but it's also really cuts against the way historians of science have worked over the years. And we were just talking about this earlier. There's very much a kind of simplistic, the positive version of science history, that there's a kind of overarching movement that can be traced from one experiment to another, one discovery to the next. More or less leaves the scientists out, but also the fact that they have lives that extend outside of their laboratories and their ideas weren't all necessarily generated in the laboratory. That was the push for a kind of one culture model, which in and of itself probably overstates the lack of disciplinary separation in the modern university. We can talk about that in the Q&A if you want. But the editors of a recent volume on the field of literature and science note the inapplicability of Snow's opposition of literature and science in earlier historical periods, but also acknowledge its marking of the sense that, quote, knowledge production in the modern world increasingly proceeds through the specialized or technical languages that enclose separate disciplinary spheres. And I think that's worth keeping in mind, that as much as I want to disrupt the two cultures model, specialization of knowledge has, if anything, only increased since 1959 when Snow said this, in a way that we need to keep in mind. So recent scholarship on the modernist era has worked to bridge the two cultures divide and contextualize Snow's comments in the culture of post-war Britain. And a lot of people have pointed out the bureaucratic agenda really behind this. He was jockeying for resources within universities and in the government. But, okay, so let me just turn quickly to shifts in the history of science a little bit. As literature and the arts are transforming and transformed by modernist sensibility, scientific and technological orthodoxies were similarly in flux in almost every field. I'll use the now common term for such changes, paradigm shifts. and we'll momentarily review what Thomas Kuhn meant and also what he didn't mean by it. The phrase is often got used in ways that Kuhn really did not want it to be used. So just to name a few, non-Euclidean geometries revolutionized mathematics. Differential geometry contributed to Einstein's theory of general relativity. Relativity undermined Newtonian ether physics. Chemistry discovered that as fundamental particles, atoms were not indivisible or stable after all. While quantum mechanics posited a mind-boggling subatomic world, extragalactic astronomy showed how almost unimaginably vast the macrocosm really was. Just as fundamentally, centuries of medical assumptions gave way to germ theory and cell theory, and the neuron doctrine shaped by the new biology of the period. Perhaps the most compelling sign of the newly complex understanding of the psyche, even within scientific circles, was the birth of psychoanalysis and sexology. Not a whole lot to talk about sexology anymore, but it was in fact, many people saw psychoanalysis as simply a branch of sexology. This age of scientific rationality paradoxically envisioned the mind itself as an arena of primitive and largely unconscious forces and provided controversial accounts of human sexuality. The emerging discipline of anthropology eroded long-held beliefs about humanity, and scientific and technological developments began to seem increasingly difficult to separate. This was the age of the automobile, airplane, synthetic plastic, radio, film, the neon sign, audio recordings, mass-market tabloids, X-ray machines, cyclotrons, skyscraper, tissue culture, and penicillin, but also of chemical warfare, machine guns, eugenics, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, and the electric chair. Even during the Great War, American journalists had already begun to refer to the conflict as the Chemists' War, as you could imagine. The chemical warfare caught the imagination of the people back home in the United States, certainly. Artistic expression was certainly transformed, but even more strikingly, it contributed to the construction of this brave new techno-scientific world. And for the most part, scholarship on Western modernist and contemporary literature has turned away from the grand unifying claims about a monolithic modernism or postmodernism, and instead has attended to interdisciplinary investigations, microhistories, material culture, and an expanded range of cultural texts and dimensions of modernist cultures in particular. The field has increasingly attended to developments in the field of history of science that have emphasized the embeddedness of science in a broad array of social, cultural, institutional, and even textual practices. As Henning Smidgen argues, post-positivist historians of science investigate, quote, the spaces in between, transitional zones populated with numerous actors, scientists and technicians, instruments and organisms, but also, and above all, inscription devices of all kinds. This is, I don't have time to talk about this today, but this is, in a way, we're in a Latour's project of science. The actor network theory can include non-human actants in the construction of scientific knowledge, and in fact, absolutely must. While offering extraordinarily focused and compellingly detailed microhistories of laboratories, instrumentation, and specific institutional dynamics, historians of science have also significantly contributed to our understanding of the larger institutional landscapes of science, revealing modernist-era institutions of science and technology to be as much in flux as the scientific theories and disciplines were. And this is no coincidence. I think these two things go hand in hand. So let me just throw out some general details of the science of the period. So with the modernism of Ezra Pound and F.T. Marinetti in mind, let us now turn briefly to an example of a similar sensibility from the sciences. One of the major events in chemistry and physics in the first half of the 20th century occurred in part through a collaboration across the far-flung reaches of the British Empire that drew together the new institutional structures of scientific research with the old. Yes, my slide here, you can see this is neuron theory, or this was when Rutherford actually broke up an atom, a nucleus of nitrogen. It knocks a proton off, which is actually visualizable in a cloud chamber, and created oxygen from it. He knocked a proton out, added two to it, and got a different element. X-rays were hugely important. I think these all. That's the Hooker telescope in Mount Palomar, which was a huge part of the discovery the galaxy, that there were galaxies beyond the galaxy, which was not entirely known. Okay, so in 1902 and 1903, New Zealand-born physicist Ernest Rutherford and English chemist Frederick Soddy published communications of their interpretation of radioactivity as a spontaneous transformation of what Rutherford later understood to be the nucleus of an atom. So, the concept of nucleus didn't exist yet. There's still this idea that an atom was like a plum pudding. It was some sort of nebulous, positively charged field that had electrons stuck in it somehow, like the raisins and things in the pudding. That got disproven later on, but one way or the other, that plum pudding was breaking up in ways that they could finally see in the laboratory. Their research, which overturned the bedrock assumptions of 19th century chemistry and atomic theory, was published in the most venerable of English scientific periodicals, the Philosophical Magazine, had commenced at the end of the 18th century, when science still wore the mantle of natural philosophy. In a sign of things to come, the staid and conservative old journal was publishing a revolutionary article by two young men in early academic posts, performing their research in the new modern physics and chemistry facilities of a provincial university, this was in McGill, in the most French of British imperial cities. Montreal was far from London, the imperial metropole, and from the prestigious colleges of Cambridge and Oxford. Orthodoxies could crumble under such circumstances in the sciences as well as in the arts. In 1908, Soddy gave a series of 6 free experimental lectures at the University of Glasgow, where he had been hired with the support of Scottish industrialist George Bileby to modernize the university's chemical research program. These lectures on the interpretation of radium would then be published in a book of that name in 1909. It was in its 4th edition by 1920. It's a hugely popular explanation. Soddy's book inspired H.G. Wells to write The World Set Free in 1914, which is the first novel to depict nuclear war. Unfortunately, it's not a very good Wells novel, but it was quite prescient in many ways. So, not unlike Pound and his battles with the established order, Soddy's interest in philosophy and history, and eventually political, increasingly self-marginalizing interests in radical monetary theory, was something he shared with Pound. They were reading Arthur Kitson and some of the same kind of so-called monetary cranks at the time. As far as I know, they never corresponded with each other, and I don't think Soddy would have liked Ezra Pound very much, as politics were quite on the left. But Soddy also shared with Pound the commitment to making it new, beginning the interpretation of radium with the prescient alignment of the public enthusiasm for new discoveries in science, with that for new works in art, literature, and music. Soddy then launched into a thrilling 250-page tour of the revolution, which is Soddy's term for what was happening, in physics and chemistry that he, in fact, had helped initiate. Emphasizing the fundamental innovation of this newly born science of radioactivity, Soddy proclaimed that its importance may surprise, quote, may surprise those who hold to the adage that there is nothing new under the sun. Frankly, that is not possible, because in these latest developments, science has broken fundamentally new ground and has delved one distinct step further down into the foundations of knowledge. Soddy was quick to praise his scientific predecessors, and like Pound, he had a deep sense of the history of his field. Quote, during the century which has just closed, there occurred, it is true, at an ever-increasing rate, a ceaseless extension of our knowledge of the nature of matter, upon which physical science is largely based. So he's talking about all the 19th century advances, especially in chemistry. With the polite audacity of a young chemist, he nevertheless insisted that, quote, this advance was for the most part an expansion rather than a deepening, which he doesn't mean that to be as insulting as it might sound, but nevertheless, I think the distinction is worth playing with a little bit. In short, both 19th century chemistry from Dalton forward and 19th century physics had taken atoms, indivisible as the word itself suggests, to be the fundamental building blocks of all matter. So the great research of the century had only expanded knowledge within a framework fundamentally incapable of explaining the anomalous radioactivity. The revolution that Soddy and Rutherford had sparked with their theory of radioactive decay required relative outsiders, young Soddy and Rutherford in the marginal lab in Montreal, crossing disciplinary boundaries, with Soddy as a physical chemist able to work with the physicist Rutherford to understand the results they were seeing in their lab. Truly new scientific insights required institutional shakeups, like those we see in the incitements and rhetorical positioning of avant-gardism in the arts. Okay, so this is more from Zani's book. This century, which has just begun, has seen the first definite and considerable step taken into the ultimate nature of their units of matter or atoms, which is in one sense not merely an extension of existing knowledge or principles, but a radically new departure. Radioactivity is a new primary science, owing allegiance to neither physics nor chemistry, as these sciences were understood before its advent, because it is concerned with the knowledge of the elementary atoms themselves, of a character so fundamental and intimate that the old laws of physics and chemistry concerned almost wholly with external relationships do not suffice. So calling radioactivity a new primary science was a bold and even radical provocation. Sadi knew well that science, like other institutions, resists sweeping change. But the way he understood the revolution that had transpired looked ahead to later 20th century work in the history and philosophy of science, and even science studies. That's what I just read. Okay, here. So drastic an innovation was, it's true, unanticipated. Radium, however, is an undisputed fact today, and there's no question had its existence conflicted with the established principles of science, which would have triumphed in the conflict. In other words, radium would have won out. Natural conservatism and dislike of innovation appear in the ranks of science more strongly than most people are aware. Indeed, science is no exception. So what could vanquish such resistance to change? We shall return momentarily to the key part of Sadi's assertion, radium itself as a new and undisputed fact. It would have become so even if in reality, as it really did, its existence conflicted with the established sciences of chemistry and physics. But note that the rhetoric of Sadi's interpretation of radium was not all that different from the challenges to conservative institutions in Pound's and Marinetti's writings. Even ignoring 5 appearances of Newly and 4 of Newer, Sadi's modest-length book contained 108 instances of the word new, such as the new epoch and the oft-repeated new science. And when K.P. Hasselberg, president of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, presented Rutherford the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in December 1908, which actually really bugged Sadi because Sadi was the chemist, and Rutherford actually knew very little about chemistry, but got the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. So anyway, that's another disciplinary skirmish. Hasselberg walked a thin line between a revolutionary and a conservative understanding of Rutherford's accomplishment. Affirming the continuity of scientific research, and of course the wisdom of the Nobel Prize Committee, he first noted that Rutherford's researches are, quote, closely allied to and form a worthy continuation of work which has already met with recognition from the Academy in the shape of Nobel Prizes on former occasions. So he mentions the work of J.J. Thomson, Becquerel, and Marie Curie, who had already been awarded Nobel Prizes. Institutions augment their authority with such rhetorical strategies, and the relatively new Nobel Prize, the first one was awarded in 1901, so it hadn't even been around for a decade yet, and the far older Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, founded in 1739, were no exception. Hasselberg then highlighted the blurry disciplinary boundaries of research in radioactivity. Though Rutherford was a physicist, his work was of absolute importance to chemistry. Quote, the above-mentioned disintegration theory and the experimental results on which it's based are synonymous with a new departure in chemistry, involving a fresh and decidedly extended comprehension of the very basis of that science. In fact, in these early years, you know, the phrase nuclear physics doesn't make any sense yet because I didn't know about nucleus, but radiochemistry was how many people from chemistry departments referred to this field that eventually would become nuclear physics. And eventually the physicists won that disciplinary skirmish and came to own the field pretty much by the advent of quantum mechanics. Continuity with the old innovators, whom the Nobel had recognized over the previous 7 years, a new departure in a field, chemistry, that was not even the disciplinary home of the award winner, a fundamental fresh comprehension of the very basis of the science. Such were the demands of a major award for scientific revolutionaries of what amounted to scientific modernism. But to grasp the modernist nature of the sciences during this period, we need tools other than those of the traditional positivist historiography of science. So this is, I'll just kind of parse out some of this territory. In order to approach the culture of a period when science and technology seemed to many to be more dynamically transformative than in perhaps any earlier era, when change itself seemed to be at the heart of science and technology, scholars engaging in science and technology in modern studies have had to transform their own methods to become increasingly interdisciplinary. Developments in the historiography of science mark this field, but so do significant interactions with research in the fields of literature and science, science studies and STS, or science and technology and society, or science and technology studies, depending on your university. These fields saw major developments across the 1980s and 90s, just as modernist studies was moving toward its own shift into the new modernist studies. And I think these things are interrelated. Okay, so literature and science. So when I say literature and science, I'm not just talking generically about literature and science. It's actually a subfield called literature and science. At least that's in American universities. You could put those with capital L's and S's if you wanted. James Bono has noted the decline by the 1970s, by the late 1970s, of a first wave of literature and science, a field that had primarily explored the influence of science upon literature and had essentially been limited to annotating scientific engagements in literary text. In other words, in that earlier version, you seek out references in literary works to science and then say something about the science to explain what the context was. And that's kind of the science is a stable given, the literature essentially just reflects the scientific culture. That was the field through the late 1970s. But Bono sees the renewal of the field beginning in the 1980s as literary and science studies scholars paid a, quote, new and intensive attention to the practices of scientists themselves. Bono explains that from the early 1980s, a new generation of scholars increasingly turned their attention to the performative dimensions of the different kinds of work avidly pursued by scientific practitioners in the making of knowledge about nature. The common thread that bound together emerging work in the reconfigured field of literature and science was analytic attention to the performative effects and affordances of literary and linguistic dimensions of science. Attention turned in parallel fashion to the material practices associated with different sciences, and thus to the performative effects and affordances of laboratory and experimental protocols, collecting, observing, recording, and categorizing devices and procedures, the material regimes constituting such analytic practices, from mathematical and statistical techniques for reading particular kinds of data, critical to specific scientific subspecialties, and finally the networks of exchange that foster the circulation of the objects, material practices, and epistemic things that contribute to the making of scientific knowledge. So this was a number of research programs looking at ways to involve textual, rhetorical dimensions of science with the material culture that generates it. So the production of inscriptions in laboratories, for instance, the Sadi's radium winning out. Basically, this was not, as it was sometimes taken by scientists, an attempt to undermine the validity of scientific fact. There was a lot of pushback against it. The Alan Sokol's hoaxing of social text by sending him a completely bogus article about quantum gravity that they didn't publish was one of these efforts to try to undermine these crazy postmodern science people in the humanities who don't know what they're talking about. That was never, in fact, what anybody was saying. It was that, yes, scientific facts are real, they're about the material world, but the way they get constructed is a good deal more complicated than historians of science tend to let on. Let's look at that embeddedness in larger cultural and textual practices was really all I was saying. In common to most of the interdisciplinary explorations that helped revive literature and science as a field was a rejection of the influence model whereby science is seen as a stable given that in turn influences literature, itself cordoned off as a separate practice. So that's the old science of literature. There's science over here, there's literature over here. They're different things, but the literature kind of looks at the science is what they're pushing back against. By the late 1990s, Susan Merrill Squire was calling for strong scholarly engagement at precisely this reconceived intersection of literature and science. As she says, I suggest that we need to shift the kinds of questions we ask away from, is this discourse primarily scientific or literary? And is it engaged primarily in the explorations of subjects or objects, toward what kind of cultural work is this doing, where, and in what ensemble of social relations? So if one's reading that closely, it doesn't in any way undermine the authority of science. It just allows a kind of cultural turn in the history of science. In the mid-1990s, scholarly arguments about the role of rhetoric, metaphor, literature, and culture in the development and reception of scientific fields and facts have begun to flourish. Significantly, much of the work that shifted modernist studies in this direction had reached a critical mass across multiple fields. Evelyn Fox Keller, author of Refiguring Life, Metaphors of 20th Century Biology, taught a program in the history and philosophy of science, and there are a number of programs like this by that time. Drawing on his disciplinary background in rhetoric, Alan Gross examined the role of rhetoric in the way scientists established and persuade each other of scientific truths. In the 1996 second edition of his groundbreaking The Rhetoric of Science, Gross noted that the rhetorical study of the history of science had attracted enough attention to have become a site of controversy. I think he was quite happy about that. And this was what led so-called to hoax an academic journal. In 1994, Susan Squire published a key work for modernism and feminist science studies, Babies and Bottles, 20th Century Visions of Reproductive Technology. And I would recommend this book to anyone who's interested in this subject. It's very clear. It's a fascinating book. It involves Charlotte Haldane and Julian Huxley, and a lot of figures are kind of on the margins of presentations that I've been hearing today. The interdisciplinary insistence of these and other scholars helped inspire a new generation approaching science and technology in modernist studies. That second wave of literature and science that Bono identifies is now a thriving area of scholarship, with the support of the scholarly infrastructure, found, for example, in the Society for Literature, Science, and the Arts and its journal configurations in the United States, and the British Society for Literature and Science in the UK. The revival and retooling of methodological agendas in the 1980s that Bono notes had produced some key works that would be taken up in modernist studies in the next decade. As George Levine put it in an influential collection, One Culture, Essays in Science and Literature, quote, it is possible and fruitful to understand how literature and science are mutually shaped by their participation in the culture at large, in the intellectual, moral, aesthetic, social, economic, and political communities which both generate and take their shape from them. This is right around the time that Ludmila Jordanava's Languages of Nature, Critical Essays in Science and Literature, began to turn to using textual analysis strategies from literary criticism to read science books, which was kind of unheard of before that. But let me turn quickly to Thomas Kuhn. I mentioned him earlier. So Kuhn's paradigms and scientific revolutions and Ludwig Fleck's thought styles. Fleck was widely unknown in America before Kuhn kind of put him on the map. I'll talk about that in just a second. So as an entry point into the large and diverse fields of literature and science studies, we'd be well served by turning to a figure who addressed some of the same issues Soddy had raised in the interpretation of radium, and gave post-World War II academia a set of terms that quickly spread well beyond his original intentions for them. That key scholar is, of course, Thomas S. Kuhn. Some half a century after Soddy's interpretation of radium was first published, Kuhn would launch The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, 1962, on its course to become the most widely read 20th century English language account of how science comes to make it new. What Frederick Soddy called the expansion efforts of 19th century chemistry, Kuhn would term normal science. And Kuhn provided the enduring and now widely circulating term paradigm shift to the phenomenon that the 1908 Nobel Prize Committee had seen in Rutherford's research. Turning from a stalling career in physics in the 1950s to work instead at the intersection of history and philosophy of science, Kuhn explored the mechanisms of change in professional science. Though it hardly advances a heroic conception of scientific enterprise, one of Kuhn's most important assertions was that the vast majority of scientific research comprises puzzle-solving activities undertaken by scientists freed from basic metaphysical and conceptual quandaries. And that's what he calls normal science. He describes the paradigm or matrix upon which scientific research programs can be mounted as, quote, the implicit body of intertwined theoretical and methodological beliefs that permits selection, evaluation, and criticism. In other words, if you didn't have a paradigm, if you walked into the lab every morning sort of reinventing the metaphysical basis of what you were doing, nobody would ever get anything done. This isn't what people do in the labs. So Kuhn's term normal science is, as Sadi understood it, inherently conservative. But Kuhn argues that it must necessarily be so in order to provide the stability for professional science to proceed. More than 3 centuries earlier, Descartes developed his intense methodological skepticism to establish a sound basis for science. Kuhn had nothing so metaphysical in mind. Rather, he looked at how science, as it's institutionalized, sustains its principles, questions, and methods of inquiry. As he put it, no part of the aim of normal science is to call forth new sets of phenomena. Indeed, those that will not fit the box are often not seen at all. Nor do scientists normally aim to invent new theories, and they are often intolerant of those invented by others. Instead, normal scientific research is directed to the articulation of these phenomena and the theories that the paradigm already supplies. And this is what Sadi was talking about, I think, when he was talking about the efforts of 19th century science really just simply being of expansion. Notice they're still working within the same paradigm, more or less, across Dalton's famous chemical treatise was 1808. It really basically was the paradigm for chemistry all the way across the 19th century. Inevitably, though, normal science will not always be up to the task. Sometimes the powerfully conservative forces of the paradigm fail to preserve equilibrium. Even working within an established paradigm, doing the puzzle-solving work of normal science, anomalies appear during research that cannot ultimately be forced into the box that the paradigm supplies. And these moments actually happen very rarely. If these things happen all the time, I think there would be a problem with the paradigm. Indeed, that process of normal science generates these moments, as the puzzle solving is tested time and time again and eventually cannot succeed. So notice, here's a process of work that's inherently conservative and working within a paradigm, but by the various reiteration of the assumptions of the paradigm, eventually it encounters anomalies that can't be explained by the paradigm. So the process itself produces its own anomalies, its own unwinding. Sadi approached this understanding when he asserted that radium itself would have triumphed even when it conflicted with the established principles of science. Radium and other radioactive elements presented the anomaly, but Sadi did not have a systematic theory of how normal science changed in the face of such refractory phenomena. Kuhn did. When serious anomalies cannot be assimilated to the paradigm, a crisis occurs, and new theories can proliferate. These new theories meet with great resistance, and those scientists whose careers have been staked upon the old paradigm often never accept any new one. A good example of that, Sir Oliver Lodge, who was one of the most eminent ether physicists of the 19th century, went to his grave in 1940 still arguing for the existence of the luminiferous ether. Pretty much after 1905, virtually no one coming into the field of physics thought that it was necessary for light to have a medium in which to propagate. I think Kuhn's interest in this is that actually scientists rarely ever just throw over the paradigm that they've staked their careers on. It takes another generation of scientists coming along to make the Tossiel paradigm out. It doesn't mean that they win over the old practitioners, but it's not necessary that they do so. For Kuhn, a scientific revolution is not simply the acceptance of a new theory. As he argues, a discovery like that of oxygen or X-rays does not simply add one more item to the population of the scientist's world. Ultimately, it has that effect, but not until the professional community has reevaluated traditional experimental procedures, altered its conceptions of entities with which it has long been familiar, and, in the process, shifted the network of theory through which it deals with the world. Yet Kuhn's most controversial proposal was one that would certainly have baffled Descartes, and possibly even Sadi. True scientific revolutions, or paradigm shifts, are rare because of the incommensurability of different paradigms. Their practitioners are essentially not even talking about the same world. Quote, scientific fact and theory are not categorically separable, except perhaps within a single tradition of normal scientific practice. That's why the unexpected discovery is not simply factual in its import, and why the scientist's world is qualitatively transformed as well as quantitatively enriched by fundamental novelties of either fact or theory. Not the second quotation in the slide. Outside the laboratory, everyday affairs usually continue as before, Kuhn explains. Nevertheless, paradigm changes do cause scientists to see the world as their research engagement differently. Insofar as their only recourse to that world is through what they see and do, we may want to say that after a revolution, scientists are responding to a different world. Thus, what Kuhn calls a scientific revolution, those non-cumulative developmental episodes in which an older paradigm is replaced in whole or in part by an incompatible one, happens very infrequently. But what concerns many scholars of literature and science is precisely what happened outside the laboratory, both before and after that revolution. And for this, one of Kuhn's major modernist inspirations, Ludwig Fleck, can provide an additional perspective. To return to the rhetoric of scientific progress, the structure of scientific revolution speaks remarkably well to modernist era concerns about that Victorian imperative. Though he still talked of scientific progress, Kuhn's model did not conform to the common view of science as a gradual, steady, and progressive accumulation of knowledge and methods. So think back to that way of teaching science as the progression of one great discovery to the next. It is progress. I mean, it's very much about a kind of progress model. This is not at all the way Kuhn viewed science. Instead, he offered an interpretation he called progress through revolutions. The assault at the strange and unassimilable on the conditions of workaday normalcy, the role of crises in producing incommensurability, but also endless change and even rejuvenation. These aspects of Kuhn's thought resonate with many facets of the earlier period's modernism. The Cold War environment of the elite American universities such as Harvard and Berkeley, where Kuhn wrote the structure of scientific revolutions, was quite different from that of Soddy's early work. But Kuhn's fondness for the word revolution, the final chapter of the structure of scientific revolutions, Progress Through Revolutions, highlights the evolutionary nature of modern science. Michael North emphasized this conclusion, noting that, quote, Kuhn's model thus shared with evolution a particularly elegant solution to the basic problem of novelty. For it turns out that normal science produces anomalies or deviations from its paradigm in the course of the same process that ordinarily produces confirmations of it. Normal science and revolutionary science, North concludes, are thus like two sides of a Mobius strip, leading to each other so ineluctably that they seem, in fact, to be the same. We haven't the time to linger on the genesis of Kuhn's thesis here, and Stephen Fuller actually has a really smart book about this, and he kind of takes Kuhn to task for a bunch of things. But the structure has deep roots not only in the scientific and technological tumult of the modernist period, but also in developments in historiography and philosophy of science that emerged from that earlier period. Great changes in science, technology, culture, and society occurred during the modernist era, but so too did the indescribable violence and displacements of the Russian Revolution, the Great War, the rise of state totalitarianism, and eventually, of course, the Second World War. From it also came a new urgency to theorize the nature of science across history, or perhaps even to protect science from the broad forces of historical change or social and political influence. Understanding science's relationship to the broader forms of thought and culture of its historical periods and the mechanisms and pressures through which scientific transformation occurs became crucially important. Kuhn's thought owes significant debts, though not always in agreement, the directions in the philosophy and historiography of science emerging from the tumultuous height of the modernist era, to the process philosophy of Whitehead and American pragmatism of C.I. Lewis, which tested the waters of arguments about incommensurability that Kuhn would much more confidently affirm in the next generation. Key influences on Kuhn also included European modernist era thinkers such as Alexander Koré, and above all the Polish-Jewish tradition and historian of science Ludwig Fleck, who lived in the Ukraine, Austria, Poland, and for some time in Auschwitz and Buchenwald, ultimately living his final days in Israel. Fleck offered to Kuhn concepts of thought style and thought collective that Fleck developed in part as a critique of the logical positivism of Carnap and Maurice Schlitt in the Vienna Circle of the 1920s. Opposing what he saw as the Vienna Circle's effort to construe, quote, as an ideal or thinking as it should be, something fixed and absolute, Fleck argued that, quote, knowledge, after all, does not repose upon some substratum. Only through continual movements and interaction can that drive be maintained which yields ideas and truth. And as Fleck maintained in the Genesis and Development of the Scientific Fact, which was written in 1935 but not published in America until much later, in fact, I think Kuhn kind of brought it into print, through a thought style, knowledge is socially and historically produced, not just described. When comparing the thought style of modern science to that of an earlier period, for example, the alchemical writing of Paracelsus or other medieval chemists, Fleck writes, our physical reality did not exist for them. Discussing anatomy diagrams from earlier periods, he argues that, quote, we are thus confronted with ideograms, or graphic representations of certain ideas and certain meanings. The interpretation of anatomical illustrations as ideograms forces itself all the more upon us, the more alien the author's thought style, and the further removed from us the era concerned. In other words, it's convenient to look back at medieval alchemy because it's clear how different it really is, but what a system it actually is and what a way of thinking it embodies. He says, so this concept of thought style in Fleck ties together sociology, history, and epistemology. He says, we can therefore define thought style as the readiness for directed perception with corresponding mental and objective assimilation of what has been so perceived. In Fleck's work, we can see the path that Kuhn would take, but we can also see some affinities with the interests of Ezra Pound and other modernist writers. The Kuhnian concepts by which, with some modification, I'm approaching our topic, are rooted in the tumult of the modernist period itself and its stoking of interest in how science addresses radical change, an issue very much at the heart of contemporary scholarship in literature and science. So let me turn just quickly to the new modernist studies. The strong resurgence of scholarly attention in science and technology and what we might now style the new modernist studies not coincidentally followed within a decade of the second rise of literature and science in the 1980s, and owe much to the concerns of that field with the latest developments in the history and philosophy of science, science studies, rhetoric of science, and in a number of interdisciplinary engagements with the production of scientific knowledge. By the 1990s, that resurgent field of literature and science had opened several new paths to scholars of modernism in literature and the arts, looking to offer rich accounts of modernism, science, and technology, during the period when modern studies diversified its methodologies, approaches, and objects of study. Essentially, modernist studies followed a trajectory Bono tracked in literature and science, from approaches simply elucidating the influence of science upon literature, the references to science and literary works, to paths in the 1990s that asked different questions from different methodological starting places. One can see a proliferation of strong exemplars of this shift by the mid-90s, and many of them were quite explicitly engaged in feminist projects. So Susan Squire I mentioned before, first monograph had been on Virginia Woolf, but in the sexual politics of London. But Babies in Bottles saw her research on quote, the role of literature in the construction and representation of science is owing some debt to the quote new understanding of how science produces knowledge launched by Thomas S. Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolution. In her groundbreaking work on modernist era discourses in the life sciences, Squire pushed Kuhn's theories of the paradigm and paradigm shift in the directions Kuhn himself would not enter with them, arguing that paradigms are, quote, often contained and perpetuated by the literary structures and forms that escape our examination when we study the proclamations of scientific knowledge, the production of scientific knowledge, by analogies, origin stories, metaphors. As Evelyn Fox Keller argued, quote, the ways in which we talk about scientific objects are not simply determined by empirical evidence, but rather actively influence the kind of evidence we seek and hence are likely to find. And that's a huge shift. In other words, this isn't just how we talk about science, but how we construct metaphors in our culture, or how we talk about what we do, the influence will actually influence what we see when we look at material objects. So again, it's not an undermining of the material, it's a kind of, it's a different kind of realism, I should say. And we don't really have time to talk about Bruno Latour, but certainly working after network theory into being able to deal with non-human actors was a big part of that. I should wrap things up here. So I want to just conclude with a brief example of the kinds of cultural connections between literature and science that this research helps highlight. To do so, I need to add one additional term to the conceptual toolkit of scholarship in literature, science, and technology, and that is the concept of domaining. So Susan Squire, whose work I've been mentioning, adopts the concept from British anthropologist Marilyn Strathern. In her 1992 volume, Reproducing the Future, Anthropology, Kinship, and the New Reproductive Technologies, Strathern explains, quote, in cultural life, in those habits of thought about which for the most of the time we are very much unaware, the ideas that reproduce themselves in our communications never reproduce themselves exactly. They are always found in environments or contexts that have their own properties or characteristics. Moreover, insofar as each is a domain, each imposes its own logic of natural association. Natural association means that ideas are always enunciated in an environment of other ideas, in contexts already occupied by other thoughts and images. Finding a place for new thoughts becomes an act of displacement. So Sparks' work focusing on the domain that's the feature of the construction of scientific knowledge about reproduction in the modernist period and beyond. And her work, quote, reproductive ideas circulate through the overlapping realms of literature, popular culture, and science via the operations of analogy, and the understanding of the domaining effect as it functioned in that circulation of ideas in Britain in the late 1920s and 30s can illuminate our present understanding of reproductive technology. This understanding of domaining is both attentive to disciplinary boundaries, but also fully aware of the creative work of their frequent transgression. And it helps underscore the ways in which contemporary scholarship on literature, science, and technology traces across the 20th century the role of literature in the development of contemporary conceptions, whether of reproductive technologies or of nuclear weapons. So one simple example of such a dynamic comes from the realm of nuclear physics. John Candiday's thoughtful book, The Nuclear Muse, highlights the birth of the atomic age in the modernist period, neatly capturing the connections among Manhattan Project physicist Leo Szilard's work on the atomic bomb, H.G. Wells' modernist era novel, The World Set Free, which was published in 1914, but was being read by the Manhattan Project physicists as they worked on the bomb, and Frederick Soddy's 1909 volume, The Interpretation of Radium, which inspired the novel. It says the first nuclear weapons were, in an important sense, a scientific interpretation of a fictional interpretation of a scientific interpretation of radioactive substances. But the atomic bombs dropped in 1945, though imagined by Wells in 1914 and by other popular science writers during the period, might also be seen as a terminus of an arc of modernist science and literature that can be traced through its relationships to radiochemistry and nuclear physics. Wells' use of Soddy's alchemical interests, themselves in part generated through different domains of an occult alchemical revival, chemistry, pedagogy, and even monetary theory, to focus on the devastating effects of the unprepared for key change brought about by the modern alchemy of nuclear physics. So in the book, The Artificial Transmutation of Bismuth into Gold, that powers the new technologies Wells imagined in Europe, is conceptualized by most at first only in terms of the material transmutation to a valuable element. With devastating precision, Wells shows the unraveling of a world economy based on the artificial value of gold, of social institutions based on wealth, signified by the ownership of gold, and by the real estate values by location, now immediately made obsolete by the new cheap flying machines powered by atomic energy, and by the labor structures now upended. Nuclear war becomes a desperate lashing out of the old structures of a now obsolete capitalist society. If the modernist age was, as Bruce Clark and Linda Dalrymple Henderson have argued, one characterized by energy, the radical revisions of Clark and Henderson's postmodern information age are hinted at when the utopia promised by cheap nuclear energy requires an apocalyptic war and a radical rethinking of the nature of human relationships by the end of the novel. But the reality of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had immediate consequences for literature and nuclear physics. Edith Sitwell's 3 Poems of the Atomic Age, written after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, tried to use the earlier period's alchemical investments to propose an ethical and spiritual regeneration of the organic and the energies of the of the atom, through a reconceptualized science in the post-war era. But the force of that alchemical understanding of nuclear physics had been lost. Radioactivity was now a bold nightmare from which a Cold War would have to awaken. Moreover, a diminution of that alchemical trope that so tied together the early science of radioactivity with literature, the arts, the pre-Enlightenment history of chemistry, and even with widespread occult and spiritual activities from the fin de siècle through the 1930s, is mirrored by the loss and even suppression of the strong engagement between surrealism, relativity, and quantum mechanics that Gavin Parkinson so compellingly traced. The weaponization of nuclear physics turned surrealism away from it. But as Parkinson notes, the suppression of moments such as these, as the intense communication and shared projects between the science and the humanities in France in the 1920s and 30s allows polemics such as C.P. Snow's two-culture argument and Alan Sokol and Jean Brickman's similar arguments to thrive in the late 1990s. We ignore that history at our peril. I think I'm going to end here because we're running late. But I'm more than happy to answer questions about any